Thanks for joining me for Modular Frontend with HTML5, Sass, and CoffeeScript, which obviously is not the title of my talk. This talk is about Bob Ross. Bob Ross, the painter. I love Bob. I've been meaning to do presentations about Bob at various conferences, and my proposals were never accepted, so I threw in some buzzwords like Sass and CoffeeScript, and it worked pretty well. So you're in for a treat. I did this talk a while back at Jeruco in Amsterdam, and during my talk, this was the hashtag, as it is today, and we got this to be a trending topic on Twitter. So do your best, I'd say. For those of you who don't remember Bob, this is Bob Ross, a white guy sporting an afro, and the only one who could pull that off. He used to be on PBS, and well, he still is in the reruns. He is unfortunately deceased, and I love to watch Bob. Bob used to make these awesome paintings, and Bob is the inventor of what I call modular painting. So here's the link with modular frontend, because Bob had this happy little tree, and a crooked tree, and this house, and this cloud, and he would use all those modules and rearrange them to create new paintings within 30 minutes. And that's what we want to do with our front-end code. We want to take those modules, take those bits and pieces, and reuse them. So like Bob, we all like to start with a blank canvas. There's nothing better than starting a new project, because this time you're going to do everything right. It's going to be awesome, like no refactoring. I thought about it, so this is going to be like awesome. So you start coding, and for a few weeks you go at it like Bob Ross, riding a unicorn through a sky of rainbows. Just to illustrate it, everything exists on the internet. I was looking for an awesome picture. I went to Google, entered Bob Ross unicorn rainbow, and this is actually your top result. I'm not bullshitting you. So for a few weeks, you go at it like Bob Ross, and you take a step back, and you expect your code to look like this immaculate Bob Ross painting. But you're greeted by something that looks more like a dead rat lying beside a puddle of cat vomit. I'll just leave this on for a bit while I'll sip some water. Oh, that's gross. So how did that happen? You have this H1, and you want it to be black. Well, that makes sense. Oh wait, in some cases, it has to be styled differently, blue and italics. So when it's used inside some element with ID main or sidebar, it's going to be like this. Oh wait, for the Twitter widget, it needs to be red. So you have CSS specificity, so the previous one will take precedence over the next one, so you add the bang important. That works. Over tweets in the sidebar, it needs to be green, so you do it like this. Like, it's only one more exception. Oh, except once. So you just add this extra class to the H1, like alternative, because that has like lots of meaning. This is how you get code looking like dead rats lying beside puddles of cat vomit. As Bob would say, oh, you'd be in agony city by now. I did not make this up. Again, the internet, go to bobrossquotes.com, and you're greeted by a whole collection of, well, things a wise man once said. A little bit about myself. My name is Roy Tomeij. You can follow me on Twitter as @Roy. Yes, I get a lot of mentions from people who are looking for some random Roy. Please give me feedback and tell me I'm doing it wrong or not. I appreciate that. I'm the balding Dutch guy you may have heard about with a weird accent. I'm front-end architect. I used to call myself front-end developer. But then I hit like this glass ceiling of the hourly rate you can ask for your work. When you call yourself architect, you can actually double your rate. So pro tip, do it. I'm co-founder of Ruby Consultancy ATBs in Amsterdam and of Slicecraft. Slicecraft is the only company globally providing Photoshop, PSD to Haml, Sass, Compass, and CoffeeScript services. And I'm writing a book on the subject, so here's a shameless plug, roy.io/book to sign up for the beta release. So A web page is a collection of modules. Luckily, I don't have to explain this in too much detail because we all know Twitter Bootstrap. You have these modules which are reusable. You can take any module, use it anywhere you want on any page, and it will just work. But we don't want the entire internet to look like Twitter Bootstrap. We already have that. Bootstrap is awesome, but you want to have like your own branding. So what we're aiming for today is to create code for your design that leads to a Bootstrap-like approach. You have your own modules styled in according to your own design and reuse those throughout your application. That means we shouldn't think about a web page as a page anymore, but only as a collection of modules. So let me illustrate by going through Hersey Gate. The gate Bob Ross must have passed so many times when he was stationed at Austin Air Force Base in Alaska. This is the website for Austin Air Force Base. This is constructed entirely out of tables. That's something like we don't do anymore and haven't been doing for the past 10 years. But the people where your tax money goes to still do it like this. So this is a page, and these are modules. We want to be able to take all those modules and use them anywhere. What you often see is like you have a module on your home page or some other page. You yank it out, copy-paste to somewhere else, and it just breaks. Because it's dependent on some class somewhere else, on the body tag or whatever, and that's what you want to avoid. You want those modules to be totally reusable. So the first aspect that we need to talk about is modular HTML5. Since the introduction of HTML5, we have some new ways of writing code that make sure we can actually write code to be reused. So this is what we used to do in HTML4. Some H1. We had one H1 because that's like for SEO purposes. Some div with ID sidebar with an H2 in there because after that single H1 comes your H2. Another div with an article with an H3 in there, and et cetera, et cetera. Enter HTML5, multiple H1s, and new elements with more semantic meaning. So instead of a div with ID sidebar, you actually have an aside. Instead of a div with a class article, you actually have an article element. This introduces, those are all new sectioning elements, and all sectioning elements you may start with an H1. That's handy, because it means we're never stuck with, yeah, I want to reuse this bit of code, but it has an H2, it has an H3, and it should be an H2 at one position I'm using it at. So HTML5 solves that for us. Now, don't go replace all your divs with new HTML5 elements. Some divs are just divs. But like aside and article and section and things like that, use HTML5. Like I said, all sections can start with an H1, which makes them great partials, because you can use them anywhere and you will never break this hierarchy of headings. If you use HTML5 and you want it to work in older browsers, meaning IE, use modernizer of the HTML5 shift so you can actually style those HTML5 elements for those browsers. Are there any SEO experts in the house? Cool. Yeah, I once had a guy actually raised his hand. Oh, he hates me so much. Yes, screw SEO experts. They were like, no, you can only use a single H1. Like, okay, who says so? Yeah, we've been doing that for ages. Yeah, there's more stuff we've been doing for ages and we really shouldn't do anymore. They're like, yeah, but you're using like 20 H1s on a page. That's way too many. So I asked the guy, well, then how many should I use? He's like, less. Okay. Like 10? Sure. The lie that using multiple H1s on your page harms your ranking on Google and other search engines is bullshit. Google uses multiple H1s on all their products and their own websites. Google in 2009, even before HTML5 became mainstream, said that it's okay to use multiple H1s, so just do it like this. SEO experts need to make money, so they will write reports and just throw them in a drawer. It'll be fine. Now, use all those H1s, structure your code in a way that you can copy, paste, and reuse, because you can do anything you want to do. This is your world. Let me again just take a sip of water while I take a step back and we take a look at this awesome piece of art. So, next step, CSS. We have some structure now. We have HTML that gives meaning to our document, and we need it to, well, look good, basically. So where to start to style something in a modular fashion? First, find a proper designer. I have seen designs where the same element appeared on multiple pages, because designers work with pages often and not with modules. The same element appeared on multiple pages, and it looks slightly different on all of them. You don't want that. You need some things to look alike to be able to reuse them, obviously. So what I like to do is print out all my designs, put them on a wall, take a Sharpie, look at the first page, and just cross out anything that's not unique. Look at the second page, again, cross out everything that is new in addition to the first page. So in the end, you'll end up with everything crossed out except for the modules that are actually unique and you need to style. Yeah, that's killing trees. If you don't like killing trees, you can kill kittens or something like that. Well, that way you determine these common elements and get to work. Now you may have this existing project. People ask me, well, I want to refactor, what should I do? I'm like, throw out all your code and start over. And people are like, yeah, we've been working on this for like 4 years and it's cost us a lot of money. And that got me thinking, and I guess that kind of makes sense. Especially you have to pay like a front-end architect. It gets like really, really expensive. So keep your current code. Start refactoring. I'm not a Rubyist. I'm sure refactoring Ruby isn't always fun. I'm sure that refactoring front-end code definitely is no fun. So I give those modules a new class name. So I know I'm not going to change CSS. I'm going to give them a new class name, put those in new files, and work from there. So find similar modules, give them the same new class name, and then that kind of makes sense, and request some leeway to normalize. As I said, a lot of websites have recurring modules that look slightly different. You need to ask your employer or your designer or yourself for some leeway to make some changes there to normalize that. That's basically the only way that worked for me to refactor. And for me, it's really important to remember that clean code goes in clean files. It's okay to copy-paste code, move it to the new CSS file, delete it from the old one, so after a while you'll end up with empty old files, just delete those entirely, and with clean new files. So when writing code, each module gets its own scope, namespace, whatever you want to call it. We'll get into some code a bit later. I start class names with mod dash, so we know that's a module. That means that you're supposed to be able to take any element which has a class that starts with mod dash in its opening tag. You should be able to copy-paste the entire HTML element up to and including the closing tag, move that somewhere else, and it should still work. That's an independent module. Use generic class names. If you have latest news, you may want to consider calling that articles or posts or whatever, because it's latest news now. In half a year, you may want to use the same module, the same styling to display most read items 2 years ago, and that whole latest news class name doesn't make any sense anymore. And use shallow selectors. We're dealing with CSS specificity, so the longer your CSS selector is, the harder it is to reuse and override. So keep that as shallow as possible. So what does it look like? A section that holds some news articles here. Starts with mod dash. We have mod dash articles for a class name. In there an h1, in there articles which again have an h1. At the bottom is the CSS. There's actually original SAS syntax, not SCSS. This doesn't have the curly brackets and the semicolons. That's the main difference. I'm using this because the SCSS makes my eyes bleed because it's too ugly. But you're free to use that. That's okay. So mod dash articles and everything that's nested inside that module is indented in the CSS. So that's kind of like scoping it to that one within that one class name. This is the wrong way to have a module look slightly different in one or two occasions. In this case, we have this articles thing and want to be only 50% wide when it's in an aside. If you do it like this and you want to be have a width of 50% somewhere else, you need to take this selector and just add another line to make it work somewhere else. So just use a second class name. In this case, mod-articles, and in the combination with narrow, you end up with the same effect, but at least you can use it everywhere. Whether using narrow is a semantic enough class name, that's debatable, but you get the idea, I guess. Well, you have generic modules. You have stuff that's being used in other modules, such as buttons, forms, whatever. For those, you need to use super shallow selectors, because otherwise you'll run into issues with specificity and the cascade. Don't limit those to specific HTML elements. You may have a button with a class button to make it look like a button. That makes sense. You may also have a link that you want to look like a button, so don't do button dot class name. Just use class names without the element selector. And for variations, describe the difference in the second class name. That's kind of controversial in a sense of that people always like, no, it needs to be semantic, so you can't use something like blue as a class name because it doesn't say anything about the meaning of the element, but the looks of the element. That makes sense. If you already use button as the class name, and the only difference is that it's blue, I'm totally happy with using blue as a secondary class name. So I use my first class name to have semantic meaning, and my second class name can be blue or whatever. Because the alternative is using something like submit, when you have a submit button that needs to look exactly the same like your other buttons, but needs to be blue. People often end up with having another button somewhere else. They also want it to be blue, and they give that the class name submit. If that's the alternative, I'd rather do it like this. So what does it look like in HTML? Well, pretty simple. You have a module, and within there you can use elements with this generic class name, in this case a button, or a blue button. And you can also limit this to buttons or other generic modules within another module. So if you don't want to use a second class name, if you're sure that your buttons will always be green for the articles module, it's okay to do it like this. This will just override your generic button styling, or at least the color, and only within the scope of this one module. Media queries, for those of you not familiar with media queries, a media query is a way to target Retina devices, apply different CSS for Retina device, apply different CSS for a certain viewport width, for mobile-first approaches, etc. They belong to a module, so keep them tied to that module and use the power of SAS, which means you can nest a media query inside some selector, in this case mod-articles, and it will output, well, what's down here, so SAS will handle that for you. This is a great way to make sure that your media queries are directly tied to your modules, and when you glance over your code, you instantly know what's going on there. I often get this question afterwards, so I'm answering it now. This is not OOCSS or SMAX, Object-Oriented CSS by Nicole Sullivan, or SMAX by Jonathan Snook. That's an approach that uses way more class names. They would have a class name on the module itself, on the H1, on like a lot of elements in there, because they want to avoid using element selectors, because you're going to style a span nested within the module in a certain way. It may work pretty well right now until you're going to add a second span in that module in the future, and it will use the same styling and stuff, breaks, etc. The goal for my approach is writing code that leads to reusability by backend developers who don't want to hang around in CSS. They just often want to copy-paste HTML from one place to the other, apply a class name to the modules, to the surrounding element, and just have stuff change. changed. So I use a lot of those element selectors. It doesn't mean you need to refactor more often, but I believe it leads to an easier way for backend developers to implement front-end code. Defining what's a module and what's not, and what people often do is take like a page and like, well, there's nothing really modular here, so I'll treat the entire page as a module. That usually only works for things like a sign-up page or a landing page, which are truly unique. Otherwise, there are way more modules in your design than you may think of right now. So it's hard to identify those modules. That's the hardest part of this method. If you can do this, you can do anything. Modular JavaScript. Front end, we have structure, styling, and behavior, so let's get on with behavior. I use class names for CSS and IDs for JavaScript. So in this case, there's two mod-articles in there, a class name and an ID. Top one I'll use for CSS, and the bottom one, in this case, to do something to call stuff method on that element using jQuery. I would do it like that, because using IDs in CSS is evil. Time for some controversy. There's a reason I use IDs only for JavaScript and class names only for CSS, because it's hard to test front end. You can test what's on your page, you can test your JavaScript, but testing your CSS is hard. Stuff can just break, look slightly different without you noticing. I've had cases where people made a small change to an ID, changed the HTML, changed it in JavaScript, changed it in the JavaScript test, that worked perfectly fine. Turned out you needed like this ID in the CSS to show this tiny icon. Those icons disappeared. No one noticed for 2 weeks. Apparently they shouldn't have been there anyway, because no one noticed the icon was gone. But still, stuff tends to break when you not only have a direct connection between structure and behavior and structure and styling, but also between styling and behavior. Things tend to break. That's why I do it like this. These for JavaScript, class names for CSS. Sometimes you want to target multiple elements with JavaScript. ID is unique. You may want to use a class name because there are multiple elements you need to match. Use data attributes. Data attributes are a new thing in HTML5, and they work perfectly well for that. So what does it look like? I have an li with a data sex attribute being male, female, or male. Bob, married to Linda, and they have a son called Steve. So those class names you could use to show little icons, and the data attributes to find all males, for instance. I chose data sex because I would normally choose data gender, but it didn't fit on the line, and I like saying sex in public. So hence the data sex attribute. So what do you do in JavaScript using jQuery in this case? If you want to find all males, well, pretty simple. Just find them by their attribute. Find any gender, pretty simple as well. If you want it to be faster, scope this to certain elements or to within some element with a certain class ID or whatever. This is faster. I blogged about this in January. I normally get like 12 visitors a day on my blog, and it spiked to 3,500 after someone put it on Hacker News. Someone would be me, because no one posts my stuff on Hacker News. Got a lot of comments, and most of them were like, this was like one of the kinder ones. To most of them, I just replied, no, my parents had me tested. People were saying this is so slow. Like finding elements by class name is going to be so much faster than by data attribute, and you're killing the internet. Like, hey, if you do one thing in life, killing the internet would be cool. So I had this test case, which I used to prove my point that it wasn't way slower. And people were like, no, that's not a very good test case. So a few weeks back, I created a new one. You can run the JSPerf test case. You go to roy.io/data test to get some metrics. So what I did, I took the HTML source for CNN.com. It has like over 1,300 HTML elements. To 751 of those, I added data attributes and class names, half of them being data gender male, half of them being data gender female, and the same with class names, and ran some tests. So in Chrome 21, you can do 970 operations per second if you find elements by class name. So on that huge DOM tree, we could find half of those 750 elements, only searching for males, 970 times per second. If you use data attributes, 922. It's slower by 4.9%, no big deal. Safari, Android, it's slower. iOS, okay, even slower than Android, by the way, even on cheap Android devices. Yeah, IE. IE is way slower. It's slower with finding elements by class name, and it's even way more slow in finding elements by data attribute. But still, 111 times per second. Or on a mobile device, 55 times per second. If your visitors come to your page, load it, you may want to bind some events to elements based on their class name or a data attribute, even if that takes like, like 20 milliseconds. That's still fast enough. So that's why I'm proposing just using data attributes instead of class names. If you do it like this, people may look at you a bit funny, but that's okay. People look a bit funny at me all the time, so you'll get used to it. Well, structure, styling, behavior, file structure. All this code needs to go somewhere. So what I do, I use a single SAS file per module. I use a single CoffeeScript file per module. This could just as well apply to CSS and JavaScript as well, of course. Use one partial per module, or not, because of I/O and things like that. So I just often end up copy-pasting HTML instead of creating partials for everything, as Sprockets isn't always right. I did a workshop yesterday about SAS and new SAS 3.2 features. People were like, yeah, I have this issue where I declare a variable in one file, can't use it in the other. And I'm like, oh, you're using Sprockets. You can't use Sprockets with SAS. You have to use SAS import. I'll show you some code. This is my file structure. I have my application.css, .sas. I have a folder with base modules, some generic stuff, and other modules. So base is like a reset, grid, things like that. Generic is text styling, form styling, your buttons, your layout, things like that. And then the actual modules, header, articles, navigation, footer, etc. So this is what it looks like in my application.css. I use Compass a lot, so I import Compass and Compass Reset. I import everything in base, in generic, and modules. Since you can't control the load order of files within those directories, doing it like this, at least you know for sure that your base stuff is loaded first, then your generic stuff, and then your modules. So if your modules depend on like generic button styling, they're loaded in the right order. When you do it like this, you can actually use variables, mix-ins, etc. that are declared somewhere else and use them in other files, as opposed to doing this with Sprockets. JavaScript, basically the same. If a module requires styling, most often does, and requires JavaScript, those files will have the exact same name. They will be in the modules folder. If they're about articles, it will both be called articles. For JavaScript, you can just use Sprockets to require those files. So if you do it like this, your code will pretty much look like this. Well, a little clock on the wall says we're just about out of time. But we have some time for questions. So, should. Yeah.
You ever put modules inside modules? Or
Ever put modules inside modules? Yes, I do.
how do you control the
That's hard. The question is, do you ever put modules inside other modules, and how do you prevent collision from happening? I try to avoid it as much as possible, because you indeed can run into the case where one module says, well, text size 20 pixels, use a module within there that just assumes it will use the default text size, and it will suddenly also be 20 pixels. That means you either need to be explicit in all your modules for way more properties than you would normally do, or you have to use important again. So I'll try to avoid it as much as possible. Sometimes that's, yeah, the only way to go, basically. Anyone else? Yeah.
It's not a very well-formed question, but how do you modularize the layout? The stuff that isn't really in the page, it's all the other stuff.
Yeah. In my generic folder, I have a file in there, usually called layout.css, which just defines just that. So that means that certain elements may have styling in various files. So the actual contents of something may be styled here, and then the actual layout of something may be styled there. Because I don't want to tie layout too directly to a module, because I want to be able to reuse modules and not have them like set to a certain width and like be as fluid as possible because of responsive design and things like that.
Do you have any opinions on nesting depth in SAS?
Yeah, I have opinions on everything, especially on nesting depth in SAS. There's a famous blog post by 37 Signals from a few years back again, who just replicated their HTML structure in SAS, just basically indenting everything, because their argument was, well, it's so easy to relate our HTML to our CSS, and they got totally burned down in the comments, because if you do it like that, you'll end up with selectors that are like this huge. So I always use the inception rule. I didn't come up with a name. It's like don't go deeper than 3, max 4 levels. That usually keeps you out of trouble, but I try to keep it to 2 at the most. Have your module indented there, just 1 level, have your other selectors, and that usually works fine. I think it's almost time for lunch, Marty. Thank you.